Okay, let's do it. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Arjun, who has a medical background and is currently a biotech investor. So we've crossed over in a few investments. We're really delighted to hear what he has to say today. So Arjun, welcome.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's been great getting to know you as well.
So what's your take on the election last week and Trump's
Whew.
resounding victory?
Yeah, I know. Well, obviously, I mean, no matter which side of the aisle you're on, whether you're American or not American, I think it was definitely a huge piece of news. Everyone seemed to be following it, and it felt much more. I think probably everyone agrees that it feels much more than just the average election. Huge comeback story for the Orange Man. Seems like a lot of things were on the ballot this time around, other than just policies and politics and things like that. And I bet we're going to dig into it. But all in all, you know, fascinated by the outcome, the fact that so many people voted for him, that they're going to control the Senate, the House. They've got a favorable Supreme Court, which is also super important, given all the things that they want to accomplish, and they're going to have the executive branch as well. So I think the next 4 years is
Hmm.
going to be a wild ride. So much has changed between his first term and now, and yeah, I just feel like it was a confluence of all these things, not just politics, but like media, and even just like vibes and the zeitgeist. So yeah, it was yeah, crazy election, crazy result, and I think you have to pay attention to it. If you're in markets like we are, then you absolutely have to. If you're in biotech, you have to. And if you're an ex addict or Twitter addict like I am, then you kind of have to as well.
Yeah, I think the zeitgeist comment is interesting because these things kind of happen on a global scale. Like I remember like Brexit and the first Trump kind of happened at the
Mhm.
same time, and you do
Mhm.
wonder, is Australia going to follow here? Like, there's immigration is a large issue here. Cost of living's obviously been huge.
Mhm.
Very like almost nobody can afford to live on the street they grew up in. Certainly not in
Yeah.
Sydney. Certainly if you grew up in anywhere in the eastern suburbs in Sydney, really. So you wonder if those issues are really going to resonate here. At the moment, it doesn't seem, the polls are relatively even, maybe a slight lead.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but I guess we'll just have to see.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you brought that up. In a lot of ways, I think it actually already has. I live in Perth at the moment. House prices have gone up around 25% in the last 12 months alone. A lot of my friends are, buying houses and things like that. A lot of them are priced out. They're having to buy houses, or if they can at all, in, suburbs really far from the city. And we've already seen that shift kind of bipartisan in Australia to try and curb international immigration, particularly targeting international students as well. So, you know, in a sense, while the two political parties haven't gone as hardcore as maybe Brexit or the Republican Party in the US, definitely there is already a shift. People are recognizing that the cost of living is going up, housing prices are going up at a tremendous rate, and I think the average Australian is like, wow, okay, things are more expensive. I can't buy a house. Something's got to change. And in Australia, the primary way which we a huge way in which we increase our GDP is by bringing in new people. But if we can't build enough houses for them to stay in, then that housing prices go up. So I think already, we're starting to see some of those shifts in Australia as well, but albeit muted compared to parts of Europe and America.
Yeah, I mean the housing thing is pretty crazy in Australia, certainly in Sydney. I mean, it's something that
Yeah.
everybody noticed. People aren't living anywhere near their parents.
Hmm.
There's also I read I was writing an article, but I didn't get to finish it. It was called like Australia's secret two-child policy.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And the idea was basically like, which it then like kicked off. This point was then made extremely well by others,
Hmm.
but it was basically how car seat rules stop the number of people having families larger than two. So
Okay. Yeah.
because everyone like very has very strict laws over how many car seats you have, the size of them, the age at which you have to sit in them,
Hmm.
if you want a third child in like a certain number of years, you had to get a whole nother car. And so you could
Yeah.
actually measure the number of people that like dropped off, like the
Hmm.
decline in the birth rate, like the number of people that stopped having kids at two. And then you could compare that to the number of lives which might have been saved by a slightly better seatbelt, basically.
Yeah.
And the difference was obviously massively skewed. Like there's many, many fewer people here today than there would be without those laws. But now
Yeah.
it seems like there's a secret one-child policy in Australia. And the secret one-child policy is a two-bedroom apartment is like one and a
Yeah.
half million bucks, like in Bondi. So,
Exactly.
and
Insane.
it's getting there. The rest of the country will probably follow. So you might be a couple, you might have one child. What, you're going to buy a three-bedroom house in the eastern suburbs? Like you basically need to
Yeah,
exit a software company, have an extremely successful investment business, like be really early
yeah.
in crypto. Like there's plenty of people who will, but you know,
Well, there is a secret
um,
third option, and that is to have parents who have 15 to 20 negatively geared properties and for them to kind of give you one, which is the kind of dark truth of it all.
yeah. That is one, but it's again, it's amazing. I know a few wealthy families in Sydney, but even their kids have to move out because if you have four kids,
Hmm.
that doesn't. It's not like you're going to sell your primary residence.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it's still it's
Yeah,
difficult. So I think that there's a good chance that those lines, those political like lines that were working so well in the United States probably would work here,
yeah,
pretty
yeah,
well. But it seems like Dutton in his approach has basically been to mirror, like just stay slightly to the right of Labor and then take all that space.
yeah,
Whereas another strategy would have been to be
yeah.
like clearly to the right and be really aggressive on immigration.
Hmm.
Like you'd have to think as like a Queensland traffic cop, Dutton's personal views are actually
Hmm.
actually far more right than he's saying. But it seems
That's
like
right.
he's
That's
just
right.
trying to stay a touch to the right and then leave all that open space, which, I can certainly see the sense in that.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Just on the cost of having a child point, there's also childcare. I mean, I didn't fully appreciate this, but just to have childcare for a year for a kid costs like over $10,000, which is not a small amount
Mm.
of money. So you can imagine having multiple children, it just explodes. And add to the fact that it's really unusual nowadays for grandparents to also look after grandchildren in the same way that, probably, people from older generations were looked after. So, there's also that cost pressure too. But yeah, you're totally right. There are some differences between Australian and American politics. I've been thinking about this a lot. I recently read the Federalist Papers, which are basically a bunch of essays um, written by the framers of the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence about how they should structure their government. And it's a really fascinating bunch of texts that basically it's basically like Twitter beef almost between all of these different framers about how should our legislative branch be structured, how should our Senate be structured, should we elect our executive branch in Australia? That's a huge difference we don't have with America. We don't elect our prime minister directly, and so there's all these structural changes like that. Even the way their Supreme Court works is pretty different to how our High Court works too. And then there's all the cultural differences as well. For instance, I think a lot of the things that were on the ballot this time, like censorship versus free speech, as an example, even even individualism versus like communitarianism, kind of felt like it was on the ballot this time in the US. But Australians just don't have as strong feelings as Americans do about a lot of those topics, particularly free speech.
Mm.
And I'm sure we're going to talk about the recent bill that Australia tried to put through, or is trying to put through, on misinformation. And I have some
Well,
thoughts
that's
about
one,
that.
yeah. On that, I've got a question for you. So when all the COVID craziness happened, I
Yeah.
saw this huge dichotomy. There was like all of my like Oxford biotech friends, some of whom were
Hmm.
involved in that Oxford vaccine company. Pretty much everybody, with the exception of a few doctors, thought the whole thing was pretty crazy, like the lockdowns,
Yeah.
the extent of it.
Hmm.
But then there was kind of like another group of people that I didn't know, but like say the medical establishment and the people that actually worked in the hospitals that were pushing very hard for those laws. But it
Yeah.
seemed to me it was frustrating because you had and then like even people I didn't know, like the leaders of epidemiology in Oxford, Harvard, and Stanford,
Hmm.
like three extremely, like three of the best, probably the best universities. Those
Yeah.
people were silenced. They were called misinformation by Australia.
Yeah. Yeah.
And their views they were taken off Twitter or Facebook, which was very annoying if you knew that there was these alternative views that said actually this is too extreme.
Hmm.
It just seems like the establishment, whatever that means, was on the wrong side of probably the biggest issue in our lives, which led
Hmm.
to the better part of 2 years, people's freedoms being completely taken away, changing who people married, whether they got to see grandparents before they died, whether they got to see parents' weddings. There's just like examples from my family.
Yeah.
Um, it was a huge question, and actually, the establishment was on the wrong side of that issue. And now they're
Yeah.
slowly kind of admitting it, and it's all coming out, and we've gone too far, but it's too late. Like at the time, the information was there. But to go back to the original question, like what did you see amongst your biotech and med friends? Were they broadly in favor of those relatively strict policies, or were they not
That's a really
at
good
the
question.
time?
Yeah, yeah. So at the time, I was still in med school. So obviously, all of my students were like, "I don't want to stick my neck out. I'm just going to do what I'm told, get the vaccines, get my passport." And so that was a funny time. So also again, the context that I had was in Perth, and Perth is, as everyone knows, a very isolated city. And so our premier at the time, Mark McGowan, he basically just shut down all the in and out flights to Perth. Can't go in, can't go out. And so inside we had no COVID. So our lives went on pretty much as normal. Obviously, to the annoyance of a lot of people who had family here from the East Coast, you just couldn't get in for. I think it was like almost in my head. It feels like a year. I don't know exactly what the dates are anymore, but so yeah, definitely at the time there was just this kind of like vague acceptance of whatever's happening. I definitely think as soon as the kind of bat narrative came out, or the pangolin narrative, whatever it was, there was definitely like a lot of skepticism, like oh really, it came from a bat, even though there's this like virology institute there. I think people had that immediate gut check. But people go along with the story for a while. You're not allowed to talk about it on a lot of websites, as you mentioned, and there were high-profile people, much smarter than I am on this topic, that were getting kind of deplatformed or shadow banned or whatever. And it's funny that all these things were found out in retrospect, many many years later. And then now it seems like there was pretty strong evidence that it actually did come from that lab, and there was maybe even nefarious action from people that funded that lab and stuff like that. And
Yeah, it was worse than that. It was a full
yeah,
switcheroo. It was Fauci. It
yeah,
was the
yeah, yeah.
same guy that was supposed to be
Yeah,
protecting
yeah,
everybody. It was the person who
it's
like
crazy. It's crazy
personally
that
signed
that's
off
true.
on the
It's crazy
funding
that
for
that's
it.
true.
It's crazy that it's true.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was the
I
same
know.
guy.
It's
It was the
honestly
biggest
you couldn't even
switcheroo.
you couldn't even write this stuff.
You couldn't
And
write
but
that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I actually think there has been a lot of public distrust in the medical profession globally. I'm not talking about Australia, but just in general. Recently, I saw some data that it kind of tracks trust in the medical profession over time, and it was like near 100%, definitely above 80, 90%, just like 2 decades ago. And then post COVID, there's this like sharp decline. And I think it's a lot of angst and frustration about the policies that you were talking about, the lockdowns,
Mm.
the even the vaccine mandates. I mean, I got all three. I think the vaccines probably did do a lot of good in the end, but how they came about, people have questions about that. Why, if you look at Pfizer and Moderna's stock price through that COVID period, they were huge beneficiaries of the commercialization of those vaccines. Where did the vaccines come from? Turns out it's probably the NIH. That's again, if you want to, if you want to keep digging on the origins of the virus and how the vaccine came from there, there's probably things that you could uncover there. But I think the kind of broader point about all of this is there's like expert, and this is another thing that I think was on the ballot, like expertism versus individual liberties and individuals thinking. And definitely the experts took a huge hit post COVID. And I
Mm.
think a big part of that is one, they got a lot of it wrong, like you mentioned. But another big part of it, which is kind of ongoing angst, is that there just seems to be no accountability for getting anything wrong anymore, especially if you're in one of these bureaucratic organizations. And to be honest, like kind of tying that back into this election specifically, I think the thing that was, I'm kind of always, I'm an EAC or pro accelerationist or whatever you want to call it, and it definitely seems to me, and I've seen for a while, that there's just like a crazy amount of regulation for things in the real world, particularly in biotech. It's probably like the most regulated industry there is, and there's all these funny things about how biotech works that it would be really good to get into. That it just shows that regulation, while it's really important in some instances, it really does set the kind of field for this what RFK calls the corporate power, no, state power and corporate greed kind of enmeshing with each other. And
Mm.
biotech's a good example of that. And you invest in biotech companies. It's probably worth us kind of maybe enumerating for the audience what some of these specific things are in the biotech industry specifically. But that applies to every industry that is heavily regulated: telecom, transport, defense, all of those things. And in my mind, one of the huge differences between the 2016 Republican ticket and the 2024 Republican ticket was this issue. They had he already had the anti-immigration stuff, or the immigration hawk stuff. He already had that. The rhetoric didn't change really much. But one thing that was new between 2016 and 2024 was this huge emphasis on trying to gut the deep state, or the federal bureaucracy in the US. And hopefully, I mean, time will tell if they're actually able to pull it off. But if they can, hopefully that kind of spurs a kind of global trend to at least, if not cut back regulation, rethink about how we implement it, who's in charge of implementing, what are the rules around people who do implement it versus the corporate powers that they're supposed to be regulating to.
Mm. A lot to unpack there. Why don't we start with the specifics on the biotech space?
For sure,
Uh,
for sure.
for example, the FDA. What's going to happen
Hmm.
there is that gets a lot of criticism. For example, people think that they should be allowed the free choice to take experimental drugs
Hmm.
outside of trial processes.
Yep.
Um, there's obviously all this stuff about food and things like that, which I'm
Hmm.
kind of I think is probably less interesting, and
Yep.
it's probably outside the FDA anyway. But those
Yep.
issues around the FDA, what's your take on the outcome of this election for that?
Oh my God, so many things to talk about there. So, well, definitely one big thing that I think we're going to see is in the US, pharma companies are allowed to run advertisements for the drugs that need to be prescribed by a doctor, which is, if you think about it, really unusual. If only a really small number of people can get my drug ever, why would I put it on, why would I pay millions of dollars for an ad for it on TV? And, obviously countries with, maybe, more sense than the US, this is illegal. You're not allowed to run advertisements for prescribed pharmaceuticals. But over there you are. And so I think that's probably the thing they'll go after first, because while the actual ads themselves don't cause any issues, what probably does is the fact that a lot of media networks and media companies are heavily reliant on revenue from pharmaceutical companies. And so, how does that affect their kind of views on pharmaceutical companies? Are they willing to run, for instance, when a new pandemic comes around, um, neutral or even negative opinions or discussions on these pharma companies and what they're kind of doing? So, I think those are kind of the like second and third order effects that um, some of the health regulatory issues they have in the US are. So I think that's probably something that they could clearly go after first and just like normalize their laws with the rest of the world and just kind of ban ads for pharmaceuticals. Um, so
That would
that's like
just down that point. It's a pretty
yeah,
good
yeah.
one. If you think about like let's say a number of different, I don't know, statins competing for advertising space. What's the
Hmm.
net positive to society of hundreds of millions of dollars of advertising? Like nothing.
Yeah,
All it does is
yeah,
actually jack up the price. So
yeah,
that the
yeah,
entire spend on advertising is reflected in the price of US drugs.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but again, like as you say, that's a huge hit for the media companies to lose that spending.
Yeah. And it's a huge hit for pharma companies in a sense as well. If the thesis is that they're gaining influence and kind of like a blind eye to a lot of their behavior, then if you remove that, then maybe the eye is more, at least the public or the media's eye is more watchfully, keeping track of what they're up to. So I think that's probably a first, one of the first things that they'll go after.
Mm.
I think some of them even talked about doing that. Other stuff, is a bit more interesting. In fact, I see kind of both sides in this when you look at the 2024 ticket that ended up winning. So on one hand, you've got RFK, who's actually, I would say, is a vaccine hawk, right? I think it's pretty unequivocal that he's at least more suspicious than the average person is of vaccines. And then on the other side, you've got someone like Elon Musk, who's trying to make brain-computer interfaces and is going against the FDA, and he wants to kind of deregulate. So this is actually one area where I actually don't know likely what's going to happen. In a lot of other regulated industries, it's clear that the trend that the Republicans want to push to is to less regulation. But for the FDA specifically, because they have RFK there, I'm a little confused about it. I don't really know which way it's going to go, because obviously RFK is definitely keen on kind of curbing big pharma anyway. I wonder if that trickles down into little biotech as well. So that's something that I'm still kind of like, I'm not really sure how that plays out. Some of the one key issue that I think uh, you brought up just now, which is people who are willing and able and adults, informed, consented adults. Is it okay for them to take drugs that are not, you know, that have not gone through phase 1 and 2 trials? And this is something that's a really interesting question, because when you have strict rules about that, people still want some of these drugs. There's clearly a market for that, and I don't know if you've heard about these jurisdictions in Honduras and other parts of the world where they basically create free economic zones where people can go and get drugs that are illegally given to them, essentially, or
Mm.
according to the FDA anyway. So that's a really interesting area. I mean, I have so many thoughts about this as someone who talks to a lot of biotech companies who are trying to get drugs into people early. A
Mm.
lot of them have brought this up to me, and I'm like, oh, I just don't know if that's a good idea, because if the FDA catches wind of that, what kind of effect will that have on your chance of success when you inevitably need to interact with the FDA?
Mm.
Um, and
Yeah, it's
then,
hard. I mean,
yeah.
there are compassionate use programs. I mean,
Hmm.
my sense is that people should probably be allowed to, but there should be, provided the data is kept. But then the
Hmm.
problem is what you have is then, particularly in say cancer, where often the drugs are extremely toxic,
Yeah.
you have this like momentum behind everywhere from like broader society down to close family of like you got to fight the disease,
Hmm.
and that like kind of like fight the cancer, like take the drug, do the
Yeah.
treatment, do the experimental, and that over the last like 50 years has just been absolutely disastrous because there's been so many horrible drugs, and, radical surgeries that
Hmm.
genuinely took decades to prove didn't really work in some cases.
Hmm.
And so you can see that just human desire to try something, to try the experimental therapy, could lead to a
Hmm.
lot of people taking stuff that is frankly extremely poisonous,
Yeah.
and unlikely to help. I can
Yeah.
really see both sides. But I tell you what, if it was me and I'd done the work and I'd done the research and I was like,
Hmm.
actually, I'm comfortable that this is, the best chance, but
Hmm.
because of the FDA process, it's already cured a few people, but it's 3 years from launch, and I
Yeah.
can't get on that program, or I can get on that program, but I don't want to be in the placebo arm.
Yeah.
You'd be really annoyed if you couldn't get it. Like you would go, hopefully you'd have the resources to go to one of these zones
Yeah,
and
yeah,
source some
totally.
yourself.
That's an interesting point, because in that case where it's still on being developed by a company and still a patented drug, I wonder if you could get it in one of these zones. But
Mm,
what what you kind of mentioned, I mean, there's so many little threads that I could pull on here. So one is the actual difference between Australia and the US in terms of pharmaceuticals regulation. So there's a lot of good reasons to develop drugs in Australia. One is obviously the financial tax rebate that you get, but another one, which a lot of people want to kind of make use of, is the fact that the TGA has slightly more lenient processes to get first in human drugs, into the clinic, as it were. In the FDA system, you have to do an IND. You have to file for an IND, which is this piece of paperwork that requires you to do IND enabling studies, which are quite onerous and often costs like $10 million to just do all the checks and balances that they want to see. But the TGA doesn't have as stringent a regulation. But Australia has world class medical system that's just as good as any. So a lot of companies, they come here, they start their first in human trials, and then they use that data package to then go to the FDA and say, look, we've actually already put it in people. We've done a lot of these IND enabling studies too, and the companies then get human data before they even go to the FDA, so they know if it kind of
mm.
works or if it's safe, if that early validity is there or not. Usually it's safety, not efficacy, but at least they know it's safe before they go to the FDA to try and raise the chances of success of their phase one there. So that's one way we could go. The other story that you just kind of reminded me of, I don't know if you saw this on the internet, but there was a scientist from the University of Zagreb who basically she had breast cancer, and then she did some research on her own on this uh, basically like viral therapy, and then she gave it to herself, and then under the supervision of her oncologist. So it wasn't just like in a garage somewhere, but she was kind of being watched by doctors, and then she actually kind of cured herself of this breast cancer. Now she was like, "Wow, this is an amazing result. I want to publish this. Let me try and publish it." Every journal is like, this has self experimentation on it, but this is going to incentivize bad behavior on the readers. So she got declined from like all these different journals, and then finally, many years later, she finally got it published. And yeah, that's just another example of how people are,
Mm.
but
Yeah.
willing adults who understand what they're doing still want to give themselves
Yeah,
drugs
so
that
if
they
you think
think will
about
help
you
them.
think about the long term good and the science,
Hmm.
having people being allowing people who can consent to this kind of stuff doing the
Yeah,
experiments on themselves, there's
yeah,
clearly a lot of benefit to that. It's
yeah, yeah.
clearly we're still in a very large planet with a lot of people. There will be things discovered that could end up being extremely helpful. And then obviously there
Yeah,
was that Australian Nobel Prize where nobody believed that
that's right. From
bacteria
Perth.
cause stomach ulcers from Perth, was it?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah. Barry Marshall.
And then he took it. Yeah,
Yeah,
hero.
I know. And
There's
at the
other stuff
time,
on yeah.
when he initially gave him first he gave himself H pylori, and then he gave
Mm.
himself the treatment. And a lot of people were like, "Oh my god, you're crazy! This is like hell unethical." But he had rational. I wonder how it would have gone if it didn't end up being right. But so maybe there's a bit of survivorship bias here. But I think if you're,
Probably
and
wouldn't have
I'm
heard
pretty
of it,
sure.
but it's an
Yeah,
example of the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
experimentation and the things you can learn from these
That's right. That's
Massively.
right. And I think if you're doing it under the supervision or even under the consent of a medical doctor, that makes it a lot safer. Like Australia actually has a really good compassionate use program for a lot of different drugs, particularly pediatric oncology, so child cancers. We have a really good system of being able to get patients who are basically kids with cancer who don't have access to treatment, whatever, getting them experimental treatments. And we've worked with people that have done that to a really good degree, and even had a lot of kids benefit from that. Some kids obviously don't benefit from it because the drug isn't really fully tested out yet. But it's always done with the kind of it's only ever done, should I say, with the kind of supervision of a trained medical professional, which I think improves it a lot. I don't know if the FDA has as strong of a compassionate use program as Australia does. So maybe that's something they look at as well under the new
Hmm.
administration.
I mean, your point on the FDA on Australian phase ones is a good one. I mean, the other thing is that the FDA actually accepts Australian phase one data, but if you're
That's right.
doing like India or China, it probably won't. And
Yep.
then you also
Yep.
have the manufacturing that they demand. It's just a fraction of the cost.
Hmm.
Um, I think that is starting to become more recognized in the
Yep.
industry,
Yep.
which is a positive. Is there anything you're looking at now that's particularly exciting in the biotech field?
Within the biotech field, I mean, radiopharma. That's kind of how we started chatting about our shared interest in radiopharmaceuticals. I think there's actually an insane number of exciting things going on in biotech right now. And I don't want to keep harping on about the regulation, but if only these things could be developed faster and cheaper. But so be it. But yeah, okay.
The
So
speed is
radiopharma's
agonizing. The
speed,
speed
the
is
speed is
agonizing.
agonizing. You know what I mean? And also the dynamics of the market is agonizing. Maybe it's worth us touching on that, after this as well. But yeah, so yeah, because biotech doesn't operate like a software market, for instance. The M&A activity is very different. The staging of validity is very different. Yeah. Anyway, so things I'm excited about. So yeah, radiopharmaceuticals is definitely one area that I'm really excited about, and that's in oncology. I think there's this mRNA drugs. For all the things that we just said about vaccines, I think mRNA therapeutics are really at a kind of turning point here, which is super exciting. Basically, for listeners that don't know about mRNA therapeutics, mRNA basically is like the instructions that our cell use to make proteins. And most disease, pretty much every disease, is like some version of a protein issue. Either the protein's not there, the protein's broken, there's too much of the protein, and so on. And so, for a huge number of diseases, you can actually use mRNA. I can give the cell the thing that it needs to make. And there's all these different ways that you can do that. You can make a receptor, you can make an enzyme, and you can target these to specific cells. I want it to go to heart cells, but not muscle cells, eye cells, but not skin cells, and so on. So we're starting to get really fine-tuned control on how we deliver these medicines and what they actually do once they're inside. Most of the applications have been vaccines and oncology, but I think we're going to start seeing that move into genetic therapies and things like that as well. So yeah, mRNA therapeutics is another area I'm really interested in. I have a huge interest in AI and how that can improve drug discovery in biotech. And so, how do you find new drug targets? How do you, once you have a target, how do you make a drug that can hit that target? There's so many different steps of the drug development process that can be influenced or improved by AI. And I think I mean, the Nobel Prize for chemistry this year was for protein folding, and that's just like, kind of the first of very many exciting things to come, I think, in that space. And yeah,
That's
there's
interesting.
just so many.
Why don't we pull on that thread? Because
Yeah,
until recently, I've been pretty skeptical about AI and drug discovery,
yep,
because the real roadblock is, I remember at Oxford there'd be like rooms and rooms and rooms full of books like this thick, and
yeah,
each one was an extremely dense scientific paper.
mm-hmm,
And that would be like one tiny subset of organic chemistry. It might some one tiny subset of like pharmacology.
yeah,
There's so much knowledge that just sits in these books or is now online and just doesn't get
mm-hmm,
used. The issue
yeah,
was never like finding interesting things to look at or writing
yeah,
interesting papers or interesting new approaches. It was always funding inhuman data.
yeah,
That was really the roadblock. And so you have
mm-hmm,
these companies that have got all these like amazing compounds and these ideas, but that's not the problem. Like the pharmaceutical companies are trying to figure out what to do with extremely limited resources. Like, I
yeah,
think there's this impression that pharmaceutical industry has a ton of money. It doesn't.
mm-hmm,
It's like I mean, in a way it does, but for this early stage stuff, it really doesn't. Like most
yeah, yeah,
most avenues of research that are promising are not investigated, and they
mm-hmm,
certainly don't make it into inhuman. Like my
yeah.
thesis has been that's been the roadblock. And if you
Yeah.
look at the listed companies like Schrödinger, XAI, Recursion, they've been
Hmm.
absolute wipeouts because they're just losing hundreds of millions of dollars every year
Yeah.
without really any outcome, any positive outcome.
Hmm.
So, what's your take on the AI approach? Having, I
Yeah.
mean, that's the bear case.
Yeah. Yeah. So firstly, the first thing to recognize is you're totally right. A huge amount of the concept to marketed drug process, that in between there is pain, suffering, hundreds of millions of dollars, all this
Mm,
regulation that you have to get through, and how much of AI, how much of those things can AI really fix? Even if you're a startup and you just really optimize just one of those areas, the other 999 steps that you have to do that are untouched are not going to, are still going to drag you down. And so, your improvement is not going to move the needle. So, again, I don't want to keep bringing this back to overregulation, but, so it is what it is. In terms of how to use AI to develop new drugs, I think you're right. There is a wealth of knowledge out there, but there's a couple of things that are happening, or have been happening over the last many years now, that are kind of coming together to, I think, you know, try and move us forward. One is a abundance of publicly available, high quality data for what kind of DNA is in different kinds of cells, what kind of transcriptome is in cells. So there's mRNA bits that I was talking about. What kind of cells have, or should I say, what different mRNAs are in different cells, kind of thing. So there's a lot of data being generated by people doing sequencing analysis on different kind of cells, different kind of cancers, people with different diseases, and so all of that's being collected right now, and it's all matched to patient data. So what demographics is this patient? What disease did they have? When did they get diagnosed? How did it progress? What drugs did they go on? And all of that can go into models that can help predict what drug targets to go after. And a drug target, you know this, but a drug target is basically like a thing that I'm going to make a drug to activate or inhibit or block or whatever. And often that thing is a biologically endogenous thing. It's something that already exists there. It's either a gene or a receptor, or so on. And one of the big issues in biotech is, what target do I make? We have really good tools at hitting targets once we know what the target is. But what target do I hit? How do I know that that target is related or going to improve this disease? So that's one really interesting area of applying AI to biotech, and it goes directly to probability of success. If I'm hitting the right target, the chance that my drug goes through a phase one, goes through a phase two, and finally a phase three actually does meaningfully go up. Or we hope that it meaningfully goes up. There are very few companies that have AI predicted drug targets with clinical assets. There's two of them. I invested in one. Fun fact: Virginomics, and what they basically do this. They look at real life patient data. They sequence it. They go, okay, feed that into an AI model. And then they ask the model, kind of thing, like, what drug target should we make a drug against? And then the AI model spits out 10. They pick the best one. They make drugs against it, and off they go. And that's in a phase 2A trial at the moment. So that's in people with the actual disease. The other
mm,
company is called In Silico Medicine from Hong Kong, and both of these are the most advanced AI based kind of target discovery companies. So that's a really interesting area. Recursion on Accenture and Recursion, they kind of had a different model. So if you look at Recursion, what Recursion has done previously, initially they were making all weird kinds of computer vision models to classify the behavior of rats that have taken certain drugs and things like that. And then now they've moved into trying to predict the modeling of how different molecules fit together. And you would have seen AlphaFold do that. You would have seen companies that are spun out of Google called Isomorphic do that. I'm a little more skeptical on that area of biotech, because, again, if you know the target, then yeah, sure, finding how it fits and trying to optimize the molecule in some way may improve how well it binds. But does that lead to a clinical outcome? It really depends on the target and all these other things. So I'm a little skeptical of that. And the other reason I'm skeptical of it as an investor in those companies is because turns out you just need a gargantuan amount of compute to do anything like that. And if you don't already have gargantuan amounts of compute, it's very unlikely that you're going to get it anytime soon. The companies that are, that are already there, like Isomorphic, like DeepMind, like even Recursion now, they just have huge amounts of capital that they can throw at these things. So yeah, my AI drug discovery thesis is in kind of new niche ways of using AI, and then really the target discovery stage. It's probably worth mentioning one more. Um, that is a really interesting area. So a lot of drug development happens one drug at a time. I have one molecule. I got to have a thesis about what disease it's going to work in, and I have to progress it through a series of trials, and I have to pre-plan what all those trials are ahead of time. Combinations are very hard to commercialize, and you know this really well. Making one drug is so hard. Making two drugs at the same time is like nigh impossible. If you want to look at drugs that are already out there, like generic drugs, and combine them, then you get into all of these IP issues. Like, okay, say you do succeed and it does have an effect. How do you patent or make any money off drugs that are freely available? People would just buy those generic drugs and make the cocktail themselves. So again, this goes to the regulation question that we were talking about. But there's now really interesting ways to use AI to kind of deduce exactly what combinations of drugs have an effect on a particular cell type. And so people are obviously using this to try and find new combinations of drugs out of ones that have previously failed or haven't done anything, to find combos that actually do improve life expectancy and so on in people with cancer.
Interesting. I thought you were going to go down a different path there and talk about how people can do trials with like the same placebo group. So you
Oh,
try
okay, yes.
multiple things with one placebo group. So less people get the placebo. You also get
Hmm.
the benefit of putting things head to head.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Yeah,
those
that
things,
goes. No,
people don't
okay,
realize how
please, please.
strategic these companies have to be. They
Hmm.
have to choose whether to go head to head, in which case it's convincing,
Hmm.
or they just do it by themselves against prior standard of care,
Yeah,
and prove the drug works, and then try and outmarket the other person.
yeah.
There's good examples like, I guess, in radiopharmaceuticals, in prostate cancer
Hmm.
diagnostics, they try and avoid dance around going head to head because they're
Yeah,
roughly similar. But once they go head to head, there's no hiding,
yeah,
and that'll make life potentially a lot more difficult. But if you're
yeah.
like an upcoming drug in an existing market with other drugs, then you have to go head to head. Basically, you have
That's
to
right.
give people a
Yeah,
reason to switch
yeah,
off established practice.
yeah, yeah,
That stuff is always quite interesting as well to see how much strategy goes into these FDA planning things. And
yeah.
again, it's just such a highly regulated industry. Like the whole game is figuring out how to play the FDA, really,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. Well, there's
or a
just
big
so much
chunk of the
to it. I
game.
mean, it's like, imagine you were building a rocket, and you weren't allowed. You only got one try at it, and you had to, you really couldn't really do any testing. Once you have set the rocket up and you go, okay, this is the design of the rocket, you're not allowed to change it at all. And you just go to send it to the moon and hope it lands. In a sense, that's kind of what trying to make a drug is like. You have to create the drug, create the indication, plan out how you're going to test it, and then once you go, hey FDA, this is the drug, you're not allowed to really modify it much anymore. And if it goes through phase one, even goes through phase two, and then fails, you're back to the beginning and you have to start all over again.
Hmm.
So there's no kind of iterative step to drug development. And I've heard a lot of people who are really smart comment on this dynamic in biotech. I don't know what the solution is, but if you could somehow implement a way of kind of encouraging iterative drug design, that would be really helpful in this dynamic that we were talking about. There are examples of this as well. Previously, the FDA has allowed iterative drug development, even GLP-1s, which are really famous at the moment. They have gone through several different iterations from the 70s to today, and really only in like the last 5 to 10 years they've become really famous because we got to fix all of those problems by trying all the ones that didn't work. Um, but that's probably 50 years of time where GLPs were not on the market, but we already knew that they did what they
Hmm.
do.
I wonder if
And
it's like
if that was
their
only
chains
10
of
years, imagine how many lives we would have saved.
yeah. I mean, I guess their chains of peptides. They're changing around. This amino acid or that amino acid might not make that much of a
Hmm.
difference. But obviously, in
Hmm.
small molecule drugs, completely different. Like putting swapping one molecule for another could completely change the outcome
That's
from
right.
working
Yep.
to not working, poisonous, giving
Yeah.
people nightmares. All kinds of things can kind of happen.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Look, it's tough. It's the regulation one. I used to have huge debates with people over this, and I was generally on the side of the FDA. I was like,
Yeah.
you don't understand how bad some of the stories are when you read about
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Like how long, and especially when if something gets like quasi approved and it hasn't been
Hmm.
gone through that robust process at the start, you never really get another chance because
Yeah.
it becomes established practice. Patients want the
Hmm.
drug, the surgeons want to give the drug. They're convinced that it works or at least has some benefit. It's
Yeah.
almost impossible to change. So you almost need that
Yeah.
rock solid thing.
Foundation. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also how like why medical devices versus drugs. I mean,
Hmm.
Hashan, who's on the podcast, made this point really well. Um, it's basically like if you have a device, it's generally easier to get things approved, less likely to kill somebody, more likely to do what you expect it to do.
Yeah.
But it's also harder to sell because it's not
Yeah.
so convincing. The
Mm.
FDA, if something's approved for the FDA, because everybody knows that it's gone through this extremely extended multi-year process with extreme scrutiny at all steps of the way, it does mean that once things are approved, you generally have a high degree of faith. As you deregulate and kind of try these more experimental approaches, you kind of
Mhm.
allow more, like open the space of drugs that could make it to market, but you definitely reduce the reliability of those and how much faith you can actually trust in it. Which I guess comes back to what we were talking at the start. Like, what is the case for allowing advertising in the drug market? Is there a case?
I honestly don't think there is a case, to be honest. If it's a prescribed medication, really the only reason you should take it is because your doctor's telling you to, or you've had a conversation with your doctor, you're an informed participant, and it makes sense for you to get it. It shouldn't harm you, and it should do something good for you. Really, those are the
Hmm.
only reasons. Um,
Actually,
that
I can think of one example. So,
okay, yeah,
a friend
hit
of
me.
mine who went to Harvard Business School told me it was a business case there,
Yeah.
and that is Propecia for male hair loss.
Okay, yeah.
Um, and so I was like bullied at university because I was losing my hair. So at the tender age of 19, I like signed up for these pills, and immediately, it's like I used to like sit at my desk and my hair would fall out, my scalp would
Yeah,
itch. I was literally like the most annoying thing in the world. And then they actually worked. And I have a twin brother.
yeah,
He never took the pills and lost all of his hair.
yeah,
But they had a huge strategic issue: were they going to market or not? And what ended
yeah.
up happening is they didn't market. The amount of most people, most men that you speak to aren't aware that there's a drug that actually works,
Mhm.
and and then because they didn't market the drug themselves, they opened up this like they left the space open for these really spivvy clinics. Do you remember when
Yeah,
you were a kid and all these ads for like hair loss, and you
yeah.
pay a doctor $20,000 to like tell you to take Propecia?
Uh-huh.
They allowed by not advertising and not telling people what they were doing, they allowed that space. And I
Yeah,
almost see something similar in GLP-1s because
yeah.
there's a big people generally there's a big there's a huge stigma around them still. Nobody wants to
Mhm.
admit they're on them. And
Yeah.
B, nobody really appreciates how convincing the data has been, how long they've been around, how safe they've
Hmm.
been for many decades, and the all the different health benefits that they're coming across. So I
Yeah.
guess there's two instances where marketing, I wonder if marketing would have made a difference. But
Okay.
broadly, I'd
So
agree it's probably harmful.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You just raised a really good orthogonal angle of drugs. So the drugs that I'm talking about are for health issues. So for I have a disease, the drug should treat the disease. And in that case, I think really, you should be speaking to your doctor about it. On the other side, what you're kind of talking about is in life improvements. It's not exactly a disease that someone has, but they think that the drug will improve their life. And a really good theoretical example of this is a life extending drug. Dying isn't considered a disease by at least the FDA at the moment. So it's really hard. It's actually kind of impossible to do a clinical trial for a drug that would extend your lifespan. So I can imagine totally, but if you could advertise for a drug that improves your lifespan, that would obviously improve its uptake. So I think the kind of orthogonal angle you're talking about is non-disease based life improvements. And there's all kinds of versions of this. If I could give you a drug that reduced your need to sleep and or improved your concentration and things like that. Yeah, those are more like products in my mind, like consumer products in the more general sense of the term. And obviously, advertising would, from a commercial point of view, be beneficial to those companies. Whether that's right or
Hmm.
not, that's an open question. How do you get those kinds of drugs approved? Again, that's an open question. It's a case by case thing, but definitely at the moment, at least in the case of life extension, the FDA's current
Hmm.
point of view is it's not a disease, so it's not a drug. So
Yeah.
there are all these
I
companies
do
trying to extend
wonder with
lifespan that don't want their
I
clinical.
feel like GLP-1s are kind of extending more into the drug space though, right? In the terms that every time they find a new health benefit, in
Mhm.
addition to the weight loss, which is obviously the real reason everybody takes them,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
it
that's
becomes
the
more and
reason
more.
most consumers take them, but they
Hmm.
started out as a diabetic medication, right? And then yeah,
Yeah.
now it turns out obesity is a risk factor for like every disease. So it turns out if you have kidney disease and obesity, taking GLP-1s improves your kidney disease. If you have heart disease and obesity, taking GLP-1s improves your heart disease, and so on and so forth. And so that's why it seems like the TAM of GLP-1s is just like uncapped or something
Yeah.
like
Well, I
that.
saw there was studies that like it improved Alzheimer's in excess of what you'd expect from the weight loss. So there
Yeah,
seems to
wow.
be more going on, probably just by
Yeah.
modulating those sugar and insulin
Yeah,
spikes
yeah.
and
Well, I need to look into that.
crashes.
That sounds really interesting. And now, there's all these like
Uh,
triple agonists, quadruple agonists. Like it's getting wild out there in the metabolic health space. And I bet we're going to see. One of the big issues with GLP-1s right now is the tolerability, so the nausea that you get, and then the other one's the muscle loss. And people are like
mm,
rampantly attacking that. How can we improve the fat loss but maintain muscle mass? And I think products will probably come out in the next decade or so that do, significantly decrease the amount of muscle you lose. And where they're coming out with more tolerable formulations, they're coming out with oral formulations, so you don't have to take injections. So much innovation happening in that space as well.
Yeah, a lot happening. Have you been tracking what else is going on in the market since
Oh,
Trump has
totally, totally,
been
totally.
elected?
Everything's pumping right now. It seems like crypto, especially stocks in regulated industries. I want to talk about the Tesla one because I saw an interest. There's an interesting thesis that if Elon Musk is in charge of increasing government efficiency, and one of the regulators is kind of in charge of is their transport regulator, maybe he can kind of expedite how quickly Tesla Autopilot can get deployed around the US, and so that's kind of getting
Probably.
baked in.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt he'll be a huge beneficiary. I mean, think about
Yeah,
the real value in his business is probably SpaceX. I think that's going to actually dwarf Tesla with time. There was an
yeah,
opportunity earlier this year to get SpaceX stock at like I think it was 150 or 200 bill. That would have been a steal.
damn.
I think that's a
You
clear
reckon that
fight
was
for
a
Tesla.
steal? You're probably right, to be honest, because that is
Absolute
one of the
steal.
filthiest monopolies that will ever exist. I mean, getting if you have a monopoly on getting things into space, that's crazy. And even with Starlink, I mean, I haven't actually used Starlink yet. I really want to, but they've talked about having a phone carrier that Starlink provides. So you have a global phone carrier. So you just pay Starlink, you get internet on your phone, and it works no matter where you go on planet Earth. You don't have to get eSIMs
He could
anymore,
actually
no
beat the
travel SIMs.
iPhone.
Yeah,
That's like
yeah,
the
that would
first
be
selling point for a new type of smartphone, and he's
yeah,
actually delivered like consumer products. So
yeah,
that would be incredible
yeah.
Apple having decided not to buy his company, he
And
like
then,
10 years
oh,
later
God.
then and became the only real competitor to the premium smartphone market.
Yeah, totally.
Um, yeah, I mean the,
And
the Starlink thing is huge. I think of what the value is of all the telecommunications around the world, and
hmm
it's like happened, but it hasn't been realized yet. Or
yeah,
like the tech is there, but it hasn't like filtered through to the
yeah,
market. But he's now
yeah,
made all that land-based infrastructure obsolete.
yeah.
Whereas the
Literally obsolete. I
NBN,
mean, and
that's
the
that stuff is
NBN,
all obsolete.
how many billions of dollars did we spend on the NBN, and it's potentially like literally
Yeah.
obsolete as of today. Because
We,
I
you
think
know,
all
you
of
know, my,
Australia,
yeah, people knew at the time. People were saying, "Look, satellite internet's going to be make this obsolete." It just
yeah,
happened faster, and Starlink is much better than anybody expected. But
yeah,
that was a
yeah,
hospital pass. I remember it was who was it? It was Tony Abbott as leader and Malcolm Turnbull in. He made him his
hmm
telecommunications minister, and it was such a funny hospital pass because basically Malcolm Turnbull was, from the dot-com era,
yeah,
very tech forward. In any other situation, other than the fact that he wanted to be prime minister, he would
hmm
have been on the side of better internet and more
yeah,
broadband and like
yeah,
fiber to the premise. Like if
yeah,
we're going to do this, let's wire everybody up.
yeah,
Like there's
yeah,
no doubt in my mind he would have been 100% aligned with like the tech forward solution. But
yeah,
because he got given this policy in opposition, he had to oppose the Labour policy.
yeah,
And then it was Malcolm Turnbull who had his name on this kind of halfway house, which has just been so terrible, where it's
yeah, yeah,
like fiber to the node or whatever they call it, and then copper wires to the house. It's
yeah.
pretty yeah, it's funny to see how it's all played out, but at
I
least
know.
thankfully Elon Musk is still there. I'm just annoyed that it looks like Qantas hasn't used him. So Qantas has obviously been very liberal, very left wing,
uh-huh.
pro the voice,
Yeah,
renaming all the towns in their announcements to indigenous names. And I wonder if it's like their politics that means they've got this terrible satellite internet, and then a lot of their planes still don't have internet, even though it's 24 hours. You get
yeah.
from here to London.
Yeah, yeah, so
I'd
true. I
love
think that's
that.
probably one of the
Yeah.
first use cases because I've heard a lot of airlines have actually started rolling out Starlink on their flights. And I just did some flights with Emirates, and you still have to pay
Mm.
$8 for like just messaging. And I was like, this is crazy. Like, surely they can just provide this. We're paying thousands of dollars for airline tickets. Surely this could just be put one little dish on your plane and I get gigabit internet. Like, why has that
Yeah.
not been done yet? So, but I think that's coming really fast, and that'll probably be most average person's interaction with Starlink when they first use that, which will be
Yeah.
really
So
good. And
think
if they
of
can
think
roll
of the
out the
value
phone
of
thing,
think of the value of that. Yeah, that
yeah.
alone is
Do,
substantial. So
do
my
you reckon
guess is
Starlink will spin out of SpaceX and go public?
I think it could. I think
hmm
I don't know what the price of SpaceX is now then. Since then, and I remember speaking to friends like we need to get some stock immediately in this stuff.
hmm
Since then, like he caught the rocket
Yeah,
and
that
then
was
he's now
just
like
that
one
was
of
a
the most
moment.
powerful men in government.
Literally, that
Whatever.
that that that
Yeah.
that just like cemented the vibe shift when he caught that rocket on the first attempt. I think that was like
I think
it
it's
was
so
done.
right, especially when it
It was
came
done and
out that
dusted.
because the whole world was watching that. That was like a
Yeah,
huge event. But Biden couldn't congratulate him on him. He wasn't part of it. And in
yeah,
fact, like something like 10 of his agencies had been trying to deregulate him.
yeah,
Sorry, attack him, take him to
yeah,
court
yeah,
for
yeah,
these
yeah,
like
yeah,
ridiculous minor offenses. So it was just
yeah.
really, it was like Trump winning has made such a huge change. So instead
Mhm.
of having a number of agencies empowered to attack, somebody that the political leaders consider an enemy, you're going to have this huge deregulation, and then for people doing big bold things, they're going to, if anything, get support if they're pro-America in the United States. It's really like an exhilarating time.
Yeah. There's
You
one
know,
other issue on the big tech regulation that it's probably worth touching on. That goes, uh, no, it doesn't really go the other way. But so AI is obviously a really interesting space right now, and there's been a tremendous push from large AI companies to kind of cement their lead in by imposing regulations on compute limits, banning open source, um, trying to have like either federal or global kind of compute governance and things like that. What's your opinion on all those things? Do you think any of that passes muster now?
well, obviously, yeah, obviously that stuff is they're not real jobs. Like if your job's to like regulate it, it's gonna come out, it's gonna happen regardless. Yeah, I mean it's significantly less likely to happen now.
Yeah.
You could see that kind of like blob kind of forming, and Sam Altman and all the others go to Washington and getting a very good reception. Let's regulate, let's do it.
Mhm.
And you can see at the extreme, which is obviously what happened in Europe, where immediately they're
Mhm.
regulating things, there's like a number of tech products now that are not available in Europe. So it's
Yeah.
not like we don't know what would have happened
Mhm.
if the US continued down that path, because you can see it in Europe, and obviously that's
Yeah.
been a catastrophe for their productivity, for their youth, for all those kinds of metrics. Even though Europe's obviously lovely in other ways,
Yeah.
so we know what would have happened. The United States is now almost certainly not going to go down that path. I
Mhm.
can't see those kinds of people getting, an ear from Donald Trump or Elon Musk. Like it's just
Yeah.
not really
Yeah.
what they believe in.
We'll
And
find out. We'll find
interestingly,
out. We'll find out how genuine Elon Musk is because he has one of these players in the race now in XAI, and to a degree, overburdensome regulation probably benefits him by pulling the ladder up on everyone else. So it'll be. I'm curious to see what his response is to this. He has been kind of pro regulation in the past, and he's always cited like artificial superintelligence as like a reason to have regulation. But as someone who's been following AI really like a lot and who's published papers in AI and stuff like that, I just don't see artificial superintelligence around the corner. Like it just doesn't seem like we're even close, to be honest. It doesn't seem like a transformer in a while loop is gonna you know behave like you or me in a job. So yeah,
I'm not
we'll
sure.
see.
Yeah, I
We'll
think it
see
might be
what
close, but
Elon's take is when it comes
I'll
to it.
tell you what. Yeah, one thing I found is on the XAI. I was also going to bring it up. It's so all these OpenAI and Anthropic, they're all putting
Mhm.
all these layers of safety into their models.
Yeah.
And then Gemini, like Google's obviously the most woke of all of these,
Yeah, yeah,
they
yeah,
put in
yeah.
so many layers that they became a laughing stock because
Yeah,
that
I
was like,
saw that.
who is George Washington? It's like a black George Washington. Like literally on like simple historical questions, it was
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
incorrect.
yeah, yeah.
Now, what they found is not only does that obviously make it unusable for anything historically or politically related,
Hmm.
but it also makes it dumber in general. So it
Yeah,
seems
yeah.
like
It
once you put all
degrades
these
model
dumb
performance. I've heard of this.
things, it
Yeah,
degrades it significantly.
yeah.
Now, XAI was always the least woke of all of them and the
Mm,
most likely to, I don't know, draw a naughty picture or,
mm,
you know,
mm.
touch on some like forbidden topic. Um, and so I think actually with everybody else shifting so far on the side of AI safety and regulation, it actually opened up space for him as a relative latecomer to have
Yeah,
probably could be one of the real challenges. So I'm pretty
yeah,
excited to
yeah.
see what happens there.
Yeah, yeah. But even there,
Um,
the vibe shift has happened already. I don't know. So Anthropic, that's one of another one of these large kind of supermodel players, and they were basically like, safety first. Like, we really have to be careful about how we deploy it. And then, like, I think either right after or right before the election, they announced a partnership with Palantir. So it's like, now they're going straight into like the intelligence agencies and intelligence software. So it's gonna be uh, more of what you're saying. I think people kind of moving away from
yeah.
safety because if it's clear that you can't apply overburdensome regulation to open source and smaller competitors, then you just have to accelerate. That's your only way of competing, and so I think we're going to go back to
Mm.
that.
which is
which is good,
which
which is
is one of
good.
the reasons why it's such an exhilarating time.
Yeah, yeah. It's the best time to be,
Like you really,
in markets or in entrepreneurship or anything like that.
yeah. Do you know the other huge unappreciated thing that's happened in markets is
Mm.
everybody's talking about deregulation and when it
Hmm.
comes to big tech, but there's been like a boot on the market of small tech. Like those things
Hmm.
sold off in 2022 and never recovered,
Yeah,
most of them, until the last couple of weeks where
yeah,
they've doubled or tripled. And
yeah.
there's probably like 100 stocks maybe that have done this.
Hmm.
Things like Upstart that were like
Yeah,
flagship 2021 bubble stocks.
yeah.
Now, what happened is, and companies like Twilio and software that
Hmm.
dropped like 90% plus. What happened is Lena Khan basically said that M&A was not possible. So in the
Yeah.
past, there was always the thing like, well, you've got billions of dollars of revenue, and depending on the size of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of customers, surely that's going to be worth something to somebody else. But that's not true if the VC funds are unable to buy. VC fund backed companies are unable to buy, and big tech is also unable to buy. You don't
That's
have
right. Yeah.
that lever, and so Biden's appointee Lena Khan, who's only 35 as it turns
Hmm.
out, um, blocked. I think it was iRobot purchase acquisition by Amazon, which
I saw.
literally was
Yeah.
really there was no there was
It's
no.
like
It's
a
not like they're
vacuum
going to
cleaner
take
or something
over.
like that.
Yeah, it was really it was a
Yeah.
statement. It was a
Yeah.
statement. It was you cannot. They're not going to let big tech really buy anything
Hmm.
now. Or it seems like there'll definitely be a new person in that seat, and
Yeah.
they'll certainly be weighted much more allowing than Lena Khan was, because that was an extremely radical approach. So I
Hmm.
think what's happening in the market is they're repricing the fact that these companies that have built up very large revenue streams that do have huge amounts of value over and above the profitability they're showing, because another buyer could just come in and gut the management and immediately add 10, 15, 20% of operating margin. I
Yeah.
think that game is back on, and that means
Yeah.
the small tech companies are ripping. It
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
means that the markets might actually reopen to the hundreds or probably thousands or tens of thousands of VC-backed companies that have wanted to list and have been completely unable.
Yeah.
So again, like talk about vibe shift and like change in regime. The regime is
Hmm.
completely changed for those. And I
Yeah.
think in my world, it's going to be one of those horrible times. I mean, we own a little bit of it, but not enough of it.
Hmm.
Um, it's going to be one of those difficult times where the regime has changed, uh, and you're really going to have to be on the right side of it. But that's very
Yeah.
scary, and you have to. It's a very scary moment because as you make those big changes, that's when you get caught on like a nasty reversal, and then
Yeah.
maybe the
Yeah.
regime
Yeah.
doesn't change. Maybe you've got the whole thing wrong. So
Yeah.
it's a really difficult time, and I think there will be a few significant outperformers for the people that get this question right,
Hmm.
that can handle the change in regime. There's significant outperformance on the table.
Yeah, because for the last couple of years, portfolio allocation towards the Mag 7 has really been a driver of most of the growth. And so you're kind of saying that now that the M&A market's kind of opening up a little bit, the IPO market's probably opening up a little bit, you think that, kind of rotating out of those large seven stocks into companies that are good targets for acquisition is probably a pretty good play. I mean, maybe have we missed it? Is it going to keep running? Does
I
Figma
don't think
reach out to
so.
Adobe again?
I think we're in like Mar I think we're in like April, May 2020. It's like that kind of thing. It's like
Yeah,
where everything is doubled off the lows, but you
yeah,
think it's over, but it's not. It's actually like kind of, a third of the way through.
yeah.
Um, and I think like at least big tech has ripped. The other thing about big tech is that they didn't really sell off that much. The sell off was
Yeah.
short. So not only did companies like Meta perform exceptionally well. I mean,
Mhm.
Meta's a rare example because that did drop 75%.
Yeah, that's
But
right. Yeah.
broadly, it's all been big tech on both the downside and the upside. And so everybody, this is a moment where the entire institutional world is positioned to big tech.
Yeah.
Not just the funds, the allocators to the funds, and the people that didn't blow up their portfolios, and they're not going to go into those small caps, which means that now that they're moving up, there is a long way to go from a 3 year bear market where literally,
Mhm.
like, I can't think of any professional investors really that stayed in that space.
Yeah.
Um, there's a real open opportunity, but
Yeah.
you can still do the work, right? Like some of them are going to be
Hmm.
good, some of them are not. And I think if you
Hmm.
do the work, which is what we're doing now on a couple, I think if you get them right, you'll probably do extremely well regardless.
Yeah, yeah. I always thought
But it
Twilio was
is,
an interesting company, but what are your thoughts on Twilio as an example? So my understanding is that they help companies do like email automation and a lot of communication automation and things like that.
yeah,
Seems
it's
like there's
like
a bunch of startups trying to do that now. So, what's your in that
yeah, the
specific
core is
example?
SMS. The core is SMS and that kind of stuff. So
Hmm.
authentication used to be done by
Yeah.
phone. Now, I met with them. I met with like the part of the management team, not the CEO, a couple months ago. And I was kind of like, well, what happens when
Hmm.
authentication is done via internet and these authenticator apps? Like that's
Yeah.
a huge part of their business. I think
Hmm.
like marketing hasn't really taken off for them. They're growing at say 10%. They've accelerated from like low single digits to 10%.
Yeah.
The peak they were 40%. That's what it looked like when it
Yeah.
was doing really well. And at
Yeah.
30-40% growth, you can really push those profitability questions out. At
Yeah.
3% growth or 5% growth, you're basically at steady state. So you
Yeah.
better have found some level of profitability. Now
Hmm.
their growth has accelerated a bit. There's a huge amount of fat to cut in Twilio. Like I think I've
Hmm.
tweeted it a few times if anyone follows me on Twitter. But they're paying the CEO, the old founder CEO, he was paying his direct reports like 30 mil US each.
Yeah.
Like he
Wow.
wasn't
That's
he,
crazy.
he wasn't like speaking to anybody that he wasn't personally paying like 50
Yeah.
million Aussie bucks to a year. Like
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
cares
That's
about like
just
forget
crazy.
forget hedge funds, forget like founding a business. Just be like the chief legal officer at one of, and it's not even a big company by US standards.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
One of any of those companies, you could be on like 20 million plus US.
Yeah.
A few
Yeah. That's
years of
insane.
that and you're done. So
Yeah. You
that's
don't. What's the point in my stock options
yeah,
if you pay me this much money?
yeah. But that's a sign of how much fat there probably is to cut in those things.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
if somebody's allowed to buy it, but I mean, I do think it's messaging is hard. I think messaging is kind of like
Hmm.
it's on the internet, it's data, it should be free, and we'll over our lifetimes that whole stuff will basically become free.
Yeah.
It's kind of like how I see payments. So
Yeah.
payments obviously went through that huge boom and bust, and they haven't really recovered. Some of them have done exceptionally well this year, but only because they were down 99 point whatever percent. So I think like
Yeah.
Sezzle, if you remember it, is up like 7 times this year. To give you an
Oh
example of
wow.
one of these companies that
Yeah.
has just really moved. But, over our lifetimes, the value of payments is going down. Like Square
Hmm.
is still charging people in the United States. They have a major revenue stream that's charging people to transfer cash to each other. Like that's
Yeah.
free in
Wow.
Australia. That should be
Yeah.
free and will be free
Yeah.
for everybody, in the near future. So you've got margins. Stripe too, like all these companies, the margins are just going to come down, and they're going to keep trying to add ancillary services. But the trend is going to be, it's going to be cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to
Yeah.
transfer money around. So I think mm, it's hard. It's
Yeah,
hard.
yeah. I'm still, I still think there are some economic headwinds to come. Like it's not. I feel like a lot of the inflation signals are still kind of lingering in the US. So a lot of this pump is just off this kind of vibe shift that we just spoke about post-election. I wonder, 2 years out, are those economic productivity gains actually going to be realized through all the different things that we're talking about, like deregulation, a better M&A market? Like, how much of this stuff is actually going to play out? If it really does make a significant impact on productivity, then we might see like another decade-long bull market, which would be just insane. How can it keep going up? I don't know.
You could. I mean, there's a few interesting things to unpack there. So, like on inflation, he's talking about like challenging Powell, and like
Yeah,
Trump
I
is
saw
not a
that.
guy that's going to want anybody like lifting interest rates on his watch. And actually,
Yeah.
inflation has come down. Does inflation reaccelerate? And then do you have Trump like allowing that? In which case,
Hmm.
asset prices are going up,
Yeah.
although with like extreme volatility, with big winners and
Hmm.
losers.
Hmm.
Um, that's an interesting potential path the economy could go down. I'm actually not. I mean, he's not even in power in office yet, so it's very hard
Yeah,
to tell
yeah, yeah. It's so hard to
how
tell.
these things
And
will
I
play
I think
out.
one of the big open questions now is how is he going to fill up his cabinet positions? And a lot of that stuff is kind of being ironed out now. I think the Senate Majority Leader is being caucused tomorrow or the day after,
Hmm.
and I think that's kind of the first major appointment that's on the cards. So you know,
Can you imagine the scramble to get one of those seats in the
yeah,
US
well,
right
it's just
now?
going to be bananas. It's literally going to be bananas. And whether he can,
Yeah.
one thing that we really didn't talk about at all is the factions within the Republican Party too. There is
Hmm.
the old school neocon Mitch McConnell led faction, and then there's the kind of new school Trump MAGA America First faction. And when he kind of went into office the first time, a lot of those positions were still the neocon wing. So he got hampered in a lot of ways. I wonder if he learns that lessons this time, or if he's even confident enough to get people that kind of support his new worldview in the Republican Party into those cabinet positions. If he does, then I think that's obviously good for him. But whether he can do that effectively is still to be decided, right?
Yeah. I feel like he knows what he's doing this time around. He's got
This
like
time,
much
yeah,
better
yeah.
people around him. And then
Mm-hmm.
the other thing, what I really want to see out of interest is, let's say he does go ahead and sacks tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of, I don't know how many bureaucrats
Yeah.
he has on the chopping board. What does that do to like the economics? Because obviously, if you fire a bunch of people, that's going to contract GDP. But also
Mm-hmm.
put a bunch of people on the job market, so it'd be
Yep.
really deflationary
Yep.
for wages.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in Argentina, they've just gone through one of these periods where Milei has just sacked a bunch of people. GDP shrank, but inflation did plummet down
Yeah,
afterwards.
yeah,
It's probably too hard to speculate now, but it'd be really interesting to see if there is that like big cutting of the bureaucracy.
yeah,
Like you have like the massive increase in dynamism as all these people whose only job is to cause trouble for and regulate the people actually creating value, and like all
yeah,
those people can be gone. So like there's be much more value creation, like the
yeah,
obviously dynamism there, but at the same
yeah.
time you got all these people that'll be looking for a job. Like I guess
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't
I
know,
wonder
how does
what
that play
effect that
out?
will have on wages. I mean, a lot of those people, they're not laborers and stuff, right? They're white collar workers, they're
Hmm.
college educated. Where do they go? And what kind of jobs do they have? And there's all these competing technological shifts right now. AI is trying to take some of those jobs. Like, it's just,
Hmm.
it's an
But
absolutely wild time.
Australia is kind of due for something like that. Like if you look at the
Hmm.
NDIS, the spending that's happened,
Hmm.
like that's massive blowout. And
Yeah.
then, in some apparently in some cohorts, 1 in 10 kids is now on the NDIS. So the other
Hmm.
9 out of 10 kids, without anything changing, if nothing changes, the other 8 or 9 kids are going to have to pay for all those costs,
Hmm.
potentially throughout that person's lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. I think. I
And
think.
like if you run a business and you're paying tax, you're shouldering all the cost of this and all the cost of the bureaucracy and everything else.
Yeah, yeah. But we've kind of caught on to the NDIS thing, though, right? I think there was like rapid growth in the NDIS budget over time, and there was a lot of legislative stuff to try and kind of reform or change it. I remember Bill Shorten got clipped famously saying that just common sense things. We just got to get rid of like cuddle therapy or something like that because that was like a
Everyone's
covered.
like, "What?" How about when somebody
Well, I
joked
didn't know
about?
cuddle therapy was on there, man.
Yeah, I think
Oh my
someone was
god.
joking about people getting prostitutes on the NDIS, and then
Oh
realized
god.
actually sex workers were covered, so it
Oh
wasn't
my
even a joke.
god. Oh my god. Oh dude, how deep does it go? Yeah.
Yeah,
No, it's gonna
I
be.
don't know
It's
if
gonna
that's
be.
fake news or not. Someone can
Yeah.
correct me, but
But you made a really good point. How much of that stuff trickles over to here? I think if they can meaningfully show that deregulating in a smart way improves productivity, then
hmm,
Europe and Oceania would be fools not to adopt a similar kind of strategy, right? And hopefully, um, hopefully that does play out. As someone who's thought about this for a while, I think that's probably a good thing if it does play out that way. How
hmm.
quickly we adopt that strategy, how quickly Europe adopts that strategy. I mean, Europe's far more dire situation than we are. So it would be really telling to see if they start to adopt some of that. There are a bunch of European elections coming up in the next couple of years as well, and it'll be really interesting to watch those.
Yeah, it'll be
Um,
interesting to see the effect on the UK, which
mhm.
obviously I've kind of been watching quite closely and spent a lot of time in. I
Yeah,
mean, they've
yeah.
got a very far left government in power there,
Hmm.
and certainly not an ally of somebody like Trump. Like he's best mates with Nigel Farage at UKIP party, so
Yeah,
his
yeah. I
his
know,
best
and
mate is to the right of the Conservatives there.
I know, I know, and UK politics is just so weird. They The last government, the Conservative one, Rishi Sunak led, won by a huge majority. Kind of, and I felt like that election was kind of like a reaction to disgruntled people from the UK. They were initially disgruntled. Brexit comes around, they go, okay, vote for change. Nothing happens. Nothing changes. Vote for change again. Nothing happens. Vote for change again. It gets worse. So I don't know. The UK. I don't want to apologize from
Yeah, I
any
mean, you
here,
could take it
but
further. You could say that they voted against those high immigration policies at every opportunity, and
yeah,
then
and it
actually,
just keeps going up and up and up, right?
yeah. So I
Yeah.
remember Brexit. It was kind of like the Polish plumber was like the archetypical, migration villain that was still in jobs, and then
Hmm.
they stopped migration from Europe and then massively increased it from like Pakistan, subcontinent, elsewhere,
Hmm. Hmm.
which I don't think
Intent.
anybody
Yeah, I
voted
don't think that was
for,
the desire of
or
the people that voted for Brexit.
I don't think that was the plan. And now it's
Yeah,
irrevocably changed the country, and it's still
yeah,
ultimately a place of liberty, of free, like there's no way that's I feel like that's now a permanent change. It's
yeah,
this talk of like deportations in the United States, and it seems like they're pointing some very serious dudes. I'm not sure if you've seen the person that will be in charge of deportations, but he's pretty scary and seems very serious about doing it.
yeah. Wow.
um, I don't see anything like that in the United Kingdom.
Yeah,
Not
yeah,
only do I not see it, I can't even I don't think it will ever come.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So those
yeah.
changes that they've made, I think, are probably pretty permanent, for
Yeah,
better
yeah.
or
Well,
worse.
demographics over there are so different as well.
Mm,
Even and again, the political landscape is just so different over there as well. Like and this goes back to how the right that Americans have to elect the executive branch that is absent in the UK. So there's just so many differences. I wonder if there is that self-correction mechanism. In the US, it seems to have just played out, which was why it was such a fascinating election because
Hmm.
people uh, told the government their mind by voting. Um, in the UK, it seems like
Yeah.
they've tried that and they've had like 3 or 4 false starts now. So
Well, the other thing that's happened in the UK is, the Conservatives have a majority. Sorry, the right has a significant majority. Labour has very few votes, but there's now two Conservative parties. And if that's not
kind of split
resolved,
it,
if
hey?
if they don't merge or like all
Yeah.
the votes collapse into one party or the other,
Mm.
then you could see it. Then it'd be very hard for them to kind of rule. Especially potentially, there's maybe they can do an alliance, but it's Nigel Farage is seen the way Trump was seen 8 years ago, which probably implies that maybe it is possible. Maybe he does take over the conservative side of that country. Oh, why don't we
Yeah.
wrap up there? I actually
Yeah. Yeah.
I hit live stream by accident, and 35 people signed on in the first like 10 seconds. So
Oh,
maybe we should
nice.
live
Okay,
stream
cool.
one of these.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Market
Hopefully
testing
they got
it.
some use out of it, and it was awesome first experience on your podcast. Hopefully, we have a couple more of these. It's always fun to chat. We have so many things so many overlapping areas of interest that it's always fun to
Yeah, I
riff
feel like
on.
we barely covered anything as well.
Yeah, I know, I know. I feel like there was so much more we could have done. We're gonna have to start one of these at 9 a.m. or something.
Absolutely. Oh, thanks again, Arjun. We'll speak soon.
Awesome. All right, thanks, Mike. See ya.